Scott Scurlock, the Hollywood Bandit, pulled off 17 bank heists, hiding behind movie-like disguises. He amassed millions, evading the FBI, until his final fatal standoff. This is the story of his rise and downfall. If you're into gripping true crime stories like this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of crime and mystery. New videos are dropping regularly, so stay tuned. Scott Scurlock was born into a well-off family in Fairfax County, Virginia in 1955. His father was a respected physician, providing the family with a comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle. From an early age, Scott was known for his intelligence and charm. He had a natural ability to engage with people, making him popular among his peers. Despite his seemingly privileged background, Scott was always drawn to thrill-seeking and unconventional experiences. As he grew older, his adventurous spirit led him in the 1970s. Hawaii provided the perfect backdrop for someone with Scott's personality. Beautiful, isolated, and full of opportunity for adventure. At looks and carefree lifestyle, he thrived in the Hawaiian surf culture, making many friends and enjoying the freedom of the island life. His magnetic personality allowed him to easily blend in with various social circles, making him both popular and elusive. While Scurlock appeared to be living a normal life on the surface, things around this period he developed and as a means of making money. Hawaii in the 1970s was a hotbed for drug activity, and Scott quickly became involved. Initially, it began with small-time dealing. Scott was intelligent and resourceful, and it wasn't long before he became involved in the illegal production of methamphetamines. His involvement in meth production took place in remote locations, allowing him to maintain his image as a laid-back adventurer while operating under the radar. The production of methamphetamines with a calculated, careful approach allowed him to succeed for enforcement while producing and distributing the drug. His operations were small enough to avoid significant attention, but they gave him a taste for high-stakes risk and significant financial rewards. However, this initial phase of his criminal career was not enough to satisfy his growing appetite for wealth, and the lure of drug production began to fade, and Scurlock sought something bigger. His interest shifted from the slow, steady income of meth production to the fast-paced, high-reward world of bank robbery. Scurlock's intelligence and meticulous nature made him uniquely suited for planning bank heists. He was strategic, patient, and had developed a deep understanding of how to avoid detection, skills that would later serve him well as he transitioned into one of the most notorious bank robbers of his time. The leap from drug production to bank robbery was significant, but for Scurlock it represented the next logical step in his criminal evolution. It offered him the thrill, financial reward, and challenge he craved, all while feeding into his desire to outsmart law enforcement. Thus, Scott Scurlock's journey from the carefree son of a well-off doctor to a career criminal began to take shape, laying the groundwork for the infamous heists that would eventually make him the Hollywood Bandit. Scott Scurlock earned the nickname Hollywood Bandit because of the elaborate disguises he used during his string of bank robberies. His ability to evade detection for so long was largely due to the care and precision he put into concealing his identity. Each time he planned a heist, Scurlock would transform himself with professional-grade makeup, fake noses, wigs, and other accessories that made him unrecognizable. He didn't just rely on simple masks or hoods. Instead, he went to great lengths to create entirely new personas. One of his signature techniques was using prosthetics to alter the shape of his face. He would apply fake noses or alter the contour of his jawline, giving him a different appearance each time. He would also wear wigs ranging from short to long, varying the style and color to ensure there was no consistent pattern for law enforcement to track. In some cases, he even changed the tone of his skin with makeup, creating a more complete disguise. These disguises were often so convincing that even bank employees who had seen him multiple times couldn't definitively say they recognized him. Scurlock's attention to detail extended beyond his facial features. He also altered his clothing style and posture, sometimes adopting a limp or a different walking pattern to throw off any potential witnesses. His disguises were never rushed or haphazard. He took the time to make sure everything was meticulously done. The disguises weren't just about avoiding immediate recognition inside the bank. They were part of a larger strategy to mislead law enforcement long after the heists were over. This elaborate approach frustrated investigators. When reviewing security footage, law enforcement was often left with little more than vague descriptions. His appearance seemed to change drastically with each robbery, and without consistent identifiers, the police had trouble linking the crimes together. It wasn't just the quality of the disguises that made things difficult, but the fact that Scurlock's ability to adapt meant that no two witnesses could agree on exactly what he looked like. One witness might describe him as a middle-aged man with a thick beard, while another might recall a clean-shaven man with long hair. This confusion made it almost impossible for police to get a clear picture of who they were chasing. Even when law enforcement began to suspect they were dealing with a single person behind these heists, they couldn't put together a reliable composite sketch because Scurlock never looked the same twice. The fact that he avoided using the same disguise more than once made their task even harder. Each new robbery forced investigators to start from scratch. These disguises became so infamous that they were a key reason Scurlock earned the nickname Hollywood Bandit. The term reflected both the theatrical nature of his transformations and the sophisticated level of planning that went into each disguise. Unlike other criminals who might throw on a mask at the last minute, Scurlock's disguises were carefully thought out, professional, and effective in concealing his identity for years. His ability to fool both witnesses and law enforcement with such consistency prolonged his criminal career, allowing him to evade capture and pull off an impressive number of heists before anyone came close to identifying him. Ultimately, these disguises were not just a clever tactic, but an essential part of his success, contributing to his status as one of the most elusive and notorious bank robbers of the 1990s. Scott Scurlock's bank robbery spree spanned from the early 1990s until his final attempt in 1996. Over the course of several years, he committed at least 17 bank robberies across Washington state, most of them centered in the greater Seattle area. What set Scurlock apart from other criminals was not only the frequency of his heists, but the sheer precision and meticulous planning behind each one. His robberies were not the work of a reckless thief, but rather the product of careful, calculated strategy. Each robbery followed a carefully crafted plan. Scurlock and his accomplices would begin by thoroughly scouting their targets. They would observe the banks for days, sometimes weeks, prior to the heist, noting details such as the timing of cash deliveries, security measures, and the flow of customers and employees. They mapped out entry and exit points and even considered nearby escape routes, always opting for banks in areas with easy access to freeways or dense urban streets where they could quickly disappear. Scurlock also used stolen vehicles to avoid detection. Before each robbery, he or one of his associates would steal a car, usually from a remote location. These cars would serve as getaway vehicles, strategically parked near the bank. After fleeing the scene in the stolen car, they would ditch it in a pre-planned location and transfer to another car, effectively throwing law enforcement off their trail. This two-stage getaway system was crucial to Scurlock's success, as it prevented the police from tracking them immediately after the crime. The robberies themselves were carried out with military-like precision. Scurlock's calm demeanor during the heists was unnerving for both bank employees and investigators alike. Unlike impulsive criminals, Scurlock would often take control of the situation without shouting or displaying aggression. He never fired a weapon during his robberies, though he was known to carry a handgun. Instead, he relied on fear and control. His disguises played a major role here, as his dramatic appearance often made him seem more threatening than his behavior actually suggested. One of his most notable heists occurred on November 4, 1996, at a Seafirst Bank in Lake City, a neighborhood in Seattle. Scurlock and his team entered the bank around closing time when fewer people would be present, and quickly took control of the situation. They ordered the employees to fill bags with cash from the vault and teller drawers. The team had timed their entry perfectly, avoiding potential customers and minimizing their time inside the bank. In less than 15 minutes, they had successfully secured the cash and fled the scene, disappearing into the streets of Seattle. What made Scurlock's heist particularly effective was his ability to avoid confrontation. In several robberies, he used fake explosive devices to control the bank staff without ever firing a shot. These devices were convincing enough to ensure compliance, but they were never intended to cause harm. Scurlock's calm, methodical approach extended to every aspect of the robbery. His team operated like a well-oiled machine, moving quickly and efficiently to secure the money and leave the scene. The amount of money stolen over the course of Scurlock's criminal career was substantial. He is estimated to have stolen millions of dollars, though the exact figure remains unclear. Unlike many criminals who squander their money recklessly, Scurlock used his earnings to fund a lavish and relatively quiet lifestyle. He purchased property, took expensive vacations, and lived well outside his means, yet always remained under the radar of law enforcement. One of the most successful robberies took place at a Seafirst Bank in the Madison Park neighborhood of Seattle in 1995. In this case, Scurlock and his team made off with over $500,000, one of their largest hauls. The robbery was executed flawlessly, and law enforcement had few leads in the aftermath. Despite the large sums of money involved, Scurlock and his accomplices continued to evade capture. However, as with many criminals, the more successful Scurlock became, the more risks he took. The tension between risk and reward grew as the robberies progressed. His early heists were more conservative, targeting smaller banks and limiting the time spent inside, but as time went on and his confidence grew, Scurlock began targeting larger banks with bigger payoffs. The stakes became higher and the planning became even more meticulous. This escalation eventually led to the ill-fated final heist in November 1996 at the Seafirst Bank on Capitol Hill in Seattle. By this point, Scurlock had refined his approach to near perfection, but his luck had begun to run out. During the heist, something went wrong. Bank employees had become more alert, and law enforcement was now on high alert for the Hollywood Bandit. A silent alarm was triggered, and within minutes the police were closing in on Scurlock and his team. Despite their usual careful planning, the team was forced to flee in a hurry. Scurlock managed to escape the immediate scene, but this robbery marked the beginning of the end. Law enforcement now had solid leads and descriptions, and they were closing the net around Scurlock. This final robbery set in motion the chain of events that would eventually lead to the standoff and Scurlock's tragic end. The law enforcement response to Scott Scurlock's bank robbery spree was one of the most extensive operations in the Pacific Northwest during the 1990s. From the outset, the FBI and local police were aware they were dealing with a highly skilled and methodical criminal, but tracking him down proved to be a significant challenge. Scurlock's elaborate disguises and meticulous planning left investigators with few solid leads, and for years, the so-called Hollywood Bandit managed to stay one step ahead of them. Initially, after the first few robberies in the early 1990s, law enforcement believed they were dealing with multiple suspects due to the varying descriptions from witnesses. Scurlock's disguises, complete with fake noses, wigs, and makeup, threw off investigators at every turn. Some witnesses described a man with a beard, others a clean-shaven man, and sometimes even the race or age of the suspect would change depending on how effectively Scurlock had concealed his appearance. This confusion created a major obstacle for law enforcement in creating a composite sketch or narrowing down a pool of suspects. The FBI's Seattle office took the lead in the investigation, recognizing the seriousness of the crimes and the highly organized nature of the robberies. Scurlock was not just robbing small sums of money. His heists were pulling in large amounts, often in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. As the string of robberies continued, the FBI partnered with local police departments, setting up task forces dedicated solely to catching the Hollywood Bandit. Tracking Scurlock was particularly difficult because of his extensive pre-planning. Before each robbery, he and his team scouted the target banks, ensuring that they knew the layout, the security measures, and the timing of cash deliveries. By the time law enforcement received the alarm during a heist, Scurlock was already on the move, following carefully orchestrated escape routes. His use of stolen vehicles also posed a challenge for investigators. Scurlock often stole cars from remote locations days before a robbery, leaving little trace that could tie him back to the crime. After the heist, he and his accomplices would abandon the stolen vehicle at a secondary location and switch to another car, effectively eliminating any chance of immediate pursuit. Despite these obstacles, law enforcement was slowly starting to put the pieces together. After reviewing the security footage from multiple robberies, they noticed that although the suspect's appearance changed, there were consistent patterns in his behavior. The suspect's calm demeanor, careful control of the situation, and the use of fake explosives all pointed to a highly experienced individual. The FBI began to theorize that they were dealing with a single suspect, a professional bank robber who was operating with military-like precision. The FBI also turned to technology, using the latest forensic techniques and crime scene analysis to gather evidence. However, Scurlock left behind few clues. He was careful not to touch surfaces unnecessarily, and he avoided leaving fingerprints or DNA at the scene. In the early 1990s, the technology to track DNA was still in its infancy, and Scurlock's attention to detail made it difficult to link him to the crimes. There were moments when law enforcement came close to catching him. In a few instances, police arrived at the scene of a robbery just minutes after Scurlock had fled. On one occasion in 1995, after a particularly lucrative heist at a Sea-First bank, officers were on the scene so quickly that they began pursuing the getaway vehicle. However, Scurlock's meticulous planning, which included having a second escape vehicle stashed in a nearby location, allowed him to evade capture yet again. Another close call occurred when investigators were able to trace one of the stolen vehicles to a parking lot near the scene of a robbery. They staked out the area, hoping that the suspect would return to the vehicle, but Scurlock, always cautious, never showed up. His ability to disappear after each robbery frustrated law enforcement, as it became clear they were dealing with someone who had thought through every possible scenario. He wasn't just lucky, his success was the result of careful preparation. As the number of robberies increased, the FBI began focusing more resources on the case. They assigned additional agents to track down leads and interview witnesses, but the key to catching Scurlock would come from surveillance and tracking his patterns. His decision to target multiple banks in the Seattle area also made it clear to law enforcement that he was familiar with the region, leading them to theorize that the Hollywood Bandit was likely a local. The media also played a role in the investigation. As the robberies continued, the press dubbed him the Hollywood Bandit because of the theatrical nature of his disguises. This media attention put additional pressure on law enforcement to solve the case, but it also provided a challenge. Scurlock, aware of the public fascination with his crimes, became even more careful in his planning and execution, knowing that the FBI was increasing its efforts to capture him. Despite their best efforts, law enforcement struggled to close in on Scurlock until the final robbery in November 1996. It was only after this failed attempt, when Scurlock's team made critical mistakes and law enforcement was able to get closer than ever before, that they finally began to unravel the mystery of the Hollywood Bandit. The years of calculated planning, elaborate disguises, and careful escapes had come to an end, but only after one of the most challenging manhunts law enforcement had faced in the region. On November 27, 1996, Scott Scurlock attempted what would be his final bank robbery. This time, the target was the C-First Bank on Capitol Hill in Seattle. Scurlock, along with his accomplices Mark Biggins and Steve Myers, planned the heist with the same level of detail and precision that had marked all of their previous robberies. However, unknown to them, this robbery would unfold very differently, leading to a dramatic chase and ultimately a fatal standoff. The day began like many of Scurlock's other heists. The team had carefully scouted the bank in the days leading up to the robbery, noting the layout, the location of the vault, and the security measures. They planned to strike just before closing time, a tactic that had worked well in previous heists, as fewer people were inside the bank, reducing the likelihood of complications. Scurlock, as usual, donned one of his signature disguises, this time complete with a fake nose and makeup, while Biggins and Myers played their supporting roles in logistics and the getaway plan. The robbery itself seemed to go smoothly at first. The team entered the bank, took control of the situation, and quickly began demanding cash from the tellers and vault. However, unlike in their earlier heists, this time an employee was able to trigger a silent alarm without Scurlock's team noticing. Within minutes, the Seattle Police Department was alerted and dispatched units to the scene. As the robbery progressed, Scurlock and his team became aware that something was wrong. The usually calm and methodical operation began to unravel as police units quickly responded and closed in on the bank. Sensing that they were running out of time, Scurlock made the decision to abort the robbery and flee before law enforcement could surround them. The team grabbed as much cash as they could carry and rushed to their getaway vehicle. The getaway, however, did not go as planned. Law enforcement had already begun to set up a perimeter around the bank, and police units were rapidly closing in. Scurlock and his team managed to escape the immediate scene, but a high-speed chase quickly ensued through the streets of Seattle. The previously meticulous planning that had always allowed Scurlock to evade capture began to fall apart as police closed the gap. During the chase, the team's stolen getaway vehicle was identified, and officers continued to pursue them. In a desperate attempt to shake off the police, Scurlock and his team abandoned the vehicle and fled on foot into a nearby neighborhood. At this point, the once carefully controlled situation was devolving into chaos. Scurlock, separated from Biggins and Myers, took off in a different direction, looking for a place to hide and regroup. His accomplices, who were less experienced and more panicked, were quickly captured by law enforcement. Scurlock, however, remained on the run. Using his knowledge of the area, he made his way toward the nearby shore of Lake Union, where he sought refuge in a houseboat owned by one of his friends. This houseboat, moored at the edge of the lake, became the scene of the final standoff. Scurlock hoped that he could use the houseboat as a temporary hiding place while he figured out his next move, but by this point the police had tracked his movements and were closing in on his location. As night fell, the Seattle Police Department and the FBI surrounded the houseboat. Law enforcement officers were well aware of Scurlock's reputation as the Hollywood Bandit, and they approached the situation cautiously, knowing that he was likely armed and desperate. The standoff began, with officers repeatedly calling for Scurlock to surrender. Inside the houseboat, Scurlock was cornered and knew that his options were running out. He was heavily armed, but by this point he must have realized that there was no real escape. His ability to evade capture for years had finally come to an end. Law enforcement had the houseboat surrounded, and there was no route to freedom, Scurlock had spent years planning his every move, carefully avoiding detection and arrest, but now he found himself trapped with no viable way out. In the final moments of the standoff, rather than surrendering to law enforcement and facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, Scott Scurlock made the decision to take his own life. He retreated into the bathroom of the houseboat and fatally shot himself with a handgun. By the time law enforcement officers entered the houseboat, it was too late. The Hollywood Bandit, the man who had managed to evade the law for so long, had chosen death over capture. Scurlock's suicide marked the end of a dramatic criminal career that had fascinated and frustrated law enforcement for years. His decision to take his own life rather than be captured reflected the same determination and control that had characterized his years of planning and executing bank heists. He was a man who had spent his life living on his own terms, and in the end he made the ultimate decision to go out on his own terms as well. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our latest videos. See you next time.